Today we're going to talk about cocoa powder. So I get asked often, what is the best cocoa powder to use? And I'll talk about that, but first let me talk about what cocoa powder is and how it came about, because that's going to help you make a decision of the best cocoa powder that you want to use. So first let's talk about the seed, or the cocoa bean. So this is what we get inside our cocoa pods. This is the seed of the cacao tree. And this is what we use to make chocolate. And inside this seed is a kernel that is about 50% fat and 50% cocoa solids. So carbohydrates and minerals and everything else that's not the fat. So 50-50 inside this bean. So let's take a closer look at the seed. Here I'm going to peel off the testa, also known as the husk. It's the shell that surrounds the kernel. And here inside is the kernel that we use to make chocolate. There's a little hole on top, which is the micropyle, and that's where the embryo is. If it was to germinate, a little root would shoot out from there. I'm going to take that out. So that's what would have grown into the root and the embryo. And you can see here we have the shells, the thin shells. I'll put that aside there. And it's a very, very thin, very permeable, which is important for fermentation. And here is the bean, also known as the kernel, also known as what would have been the cotyledon of the growing seed. And it's what we use to make chocolate. It's also known as the cacao nib. So when they're broken up like this is what we call a cacao nib. It's basically the kernel or the cotyledon of the cacao seed. And that's what we use to make chocolate and to make cocoa powder. And this is going to be important, so just keep in mind that there's 50% fat, there's a lot of fat in a cocoa bean. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of how cocoa powder came to be. So in Mesoamerica, where chocolate was discovered by the Spanish, chocolate was a drink, and it was a drink that used this cocoa bean ground up into a paste, mixed with cold or warm water and spices, mixed up, frothed up, and that was a chocolate. That was what chocolate was. It was a drink. It was a spiced, cocoa-based, water-based, frothy drink. Now when the Spanish come, they adopt this and they bring it to Europe. And Europe also makes a ground up cocoa bean water-based drink, but it's usually almost always served hot, whereas in Mesoamerica it was cold or warm. In Europe it was hot and even boiled a lot as well. And what happens when we boil something that has a lot of fat? Remember, cocoa bean is 50% fat. So if you ever made a stew or a chicken broth, then a lot of that fat rises to the top. And the same thing happened with their drinks. They were having issues in Europe with cooking the chocolate drinks in the water and getting all that fat, and they had to skim the fat off, and it was very tedious. There was a lot of work involved, very, very labor intensive. So in 1828, the Dutch, Conrad Jonas van Houten, invented a hydraulic cocoa press. So this was a machine that squeezed the cocoa bean, squeezed the fat out of it, so that you have two products. You have cocoa butter and what's called a cocoa press cake. So let's take a closer look again. We have the seed is pressed, the fat is released, and then we end up with two products. We have the cocoa press cake and the cocoa butter. So that seed is about 50% fat, 50% cocoa solids. And it's the press cake that's pulverized and ground up into your cocoa powder. So not only did they release or remove a lot of the fat from the cocoa bean, they also alkalized it. And what that means is they added potassium salts or sodium bicarbonates into the bean or into the cocoa powder, and it brought it from an acidic product to a more neutral product. And the reason for that is they found that made it more miscible in water. It mixed a lot better in the water, because even though they squeezed a lot of the fat out, they didn't squeeze all the fat out. So there's still fat in the cocoa press cake, in the cocoa powder. And so alkalizing it made it easier to mix into their water-based drinks, because their drinks were pretty much water-based back then. The English introduced milk and eggs and things like that, but their drinks were usually water-based, and so you needed something that would mix well in the water. And we know fat and water don't get along very well. And the hydraulic press also made it more affordable for other people to start making their chocolate drinks. So chocolate came into Europe through the aristocrats, through the royals, and it was very expensive, exotic import. But now that they had machines that were able to pump out this powder that people could use in their drinks, it was a lot cheaper as well. So the Dutch invented cocoa powder. They alkalized it to make it easier to mix in the water, and they also made it a lot cheaper. So everyone started doing this, even in other countries as well. And then about 20 years later, Fry and Sons invented the chocolate bar. And how did it come to be? They were producing their cocoa powder, and they had all this excess fat. And they were wondering, what can we do with this fat? So they mixed the fat with the cocoa powder and sugar and made a tablet. They made the first chocolate bar. It wasn't as smooth as the chocolate bars we know today, but it was essentially the first chocolate bar. Now, that's not really how chocolate is made today. Today we get the whole bean, the whole nib, we grind it up, we mix our sugar, grind that up into a paste. We don't take cocoa powder and cocoa butter and mix it together. It's not really chocolate. That's not how you make chocolate. It's not, you're definitely not a high quality product. So if you ever see chocolate bars that introduce cocoa powder into it, it's not a high quality chocolate. Now that brings us to 19th and 21st century. We have both chocolate bars and chocolate drinks. But when it comes to drinking chocolate, when it comes to hot chocolate, cold beverages, whatever, cocoa powder is what people predominantly use to make their drinks. So we can still make our drinks with chocolate, but most people gravitate towards cocoa powder. And that has a lot to do with the fact that it was mass produced. A lot of these companies were making these incredible mixes, chocolate mixes you can make at home. But to be honest, if you want a really good high quality hot chocolate, you got to use a good quality chocolate, not cocoa powder. But you can still use it. And I'll talk a little bit more about uses of cocoa powder as well. So now we understand how cocoa powder came to be. So what about the cocoa powder of today? Well, most of the cocoa powder is made with bulk cacao, bulk commercial cacao. And that's what goes into making many of the big brands of chocolate you know. Many of the ones on the supermarkets, all that sort of stuff uses bulk cacao. It's not the best, finest aromatic cacao that's out there, right? It's grown on trees that produce big pods, more resistant to a lot of diseases, so more profitable, but the quality is not that great. They're usually more bitter. They don't have a lot of depth as far as aromas go, and they also sometimes are not handled with care, and so they'll have off flavors and bad flavors in there as well. So it doesn't mean that all bulk cacao is terrible. There's grades of it as well, but generally you're not going to use a high quality cacao to make cocoa powder. It's very rare. There might be a small producer out there who's growing their own cacao, or they're getting a good source and they're doing that, but it's very, 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 very rare. Even more rare than bean-to-bar chocolate makers these days, the craft chocolate makers. As far as not only what cacao they use, but how they manufacture it. So how they alkalize it, how much they alkalize it, whether they're using the whole bean or just the nibs to make the cocoa powder. A lot of cocoa powder out there has more of that shell, the little husk around the cocoa bean that I was talking about earlier. And you don't want that in your cocoa powder. You definitely don't want it in your chocolate. There's always going to be little residual amounts of it, which is fine. But generally, the testa, that shell, has more astringent properties to it. It's going to make it more stringent, more dry, more bitter. And also, the shell a lot of times carries more contaminants, whether it's heavy metals or other things like that that you don't want in there. And there are some manufacturers that do produce poorer quality cacao, and they bulk it up by mixing in more of the shell. And there are people that use the shell. There's companies that use that shell to make a tea. They look and analyze the cacao shells before they use it and make sure it doesn't have a lot of contaminants in it. But regardless of whether it has contaminants or not, it's using an inferior product to bulk up the cocoa powder, right? So there's various qualities of cocoa powder out there in the market, and you don't know if the beans they were using were kind of moldy and not so good, if they have a lot of shell in there. Generally, cocoa powder is kind of an afterthought. Like, we use it a lot, but as far as a quality product goes, it's not going to have the same standard as a cocoa bean or high percentage, high quality dark chocolate. And alkalizing. So what else does alkalizing do? We know that it helped make the cocoa powder more miscible in water. It's better to mix. But alkalization, also referred to as Dutching, right, because the Dutch invented it, it also strips a lot of its antioxidants. And the antioxidants are why some people today choose to add cocoa powder to their smoothies or things like that. But the alkalization process actually strips a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And so if you're wanting to add a cocoa-based product to your food or your beverage or something like that, you're better off with a high percentage dark chocolate or cocoa nibs because that are not alkalized. And you can find a lot that are not. But a high quality craft dark chocolate is not going to be alkalized. Normally it would have to say alkalized on the wrapper in the ingredients. And usually it'll say sodium bicarbonate or alkalized or Dutched. And a lot of people think Dutched means high quality. It doesn't mean that at all. It's just that process of alkalizing the cocoa powder. It has nothing to do with Holland or Europe or higher standard, higher flavor. It's just the alkalization. And it's very cachet sometimes to associate things with certain countries, right? So, when you're associating your product, your chocolate product with France or with old Europe or something like that, it just sounds wholesome and better and higher quality, but that's not necessarily the case. It usually comes down to marketing. Alkalization also makes the cocoa powder a lot darker. So when you have a really dark cocoa powder, people think, wow, that's nice, it's intense, got a lot of flavor, it's good for you, it's got more antioxidants. Not really. It's just the alkalization, bringing it from an acid to more neutral, is making it darker. And also it could be darker because they burnt the cacao or like they roasted it really far, which also burns a lot of those antioxidants out. It also mellows out the flavor. So that brings me back to the bulk cacao and fine cacao idea. You can't really, or you can, but a lot of people don't use fine cacao to make cocoa powder because when you alkalize it, which almost all cocoa powder is, it's going to be really, really hard to find cocoa powder that's not alkalized, unless it's raw, but we'll talk about that in a second. So they're not going to use fine cacao because it's going to strip of the essence of it, right? Fine cacao is fine cacao because it's not bitter, it's not sour, and it has a complexity of aromas to it. So mellowing or alkalization will mellow out the astringency, the acidity, the bitterness, the moldy aromas. Why would you have to do that if you're using good cacao in the first place, aside from the fact that you want it to mix in the water? It's because they're not using great cacao, and alkalization is a really good way to get rid of those bad flavors, right? And it's not to say that, you should feel embarrassed that you use cacao powder because it's made with bulk cacao or something like that. I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm just trying to help you understand the quality of it. And chances are it's not a high quality product. So now let's talk about raw cocoa powder. So generally anything raw, whether it's raw chocolate, raw cocoa powder, raw cocoa beans, means that it's not roasted. So raw cocoa powder is made from cocoa beans or cocoa nibs that are not roasted. And the reason that a lot of these people choose the raw route is the roasting does diminish a lot of the antioxidants. But that said, roasted cacao beans and chocolate made from roasted cacao beans still have way, way more antioxidants than most of your high antioxidant fruits and vegetables. So even roasted ones are still very high in antioxidant power. Now, not roasting the cacao will also make it very light in color, because the roasting is what darkens it a lot. And it's going to have a unique flavor to it. It's not going to have that strong cocoa flavor. That cocoa flavor is built by roasting it at higher temperatures that build the pyrazines and the aromas associated with that cocoa flavor. You're not going to get that in your raw cocoa powder. It's going to have a much more wild flavor. It's going to taste a lot different than what you're used to. And you might like it or you might not like it. And raw cocoa powder is also often not alkalized. Now you can say, so I can use cocoa powder in my smoothies and things if it's raw. True, you can, because raw cocoa powder generally isn't. And you can see on the label, look at the ingredients. If it says Dutched or alkalized or sodium bicarbonate, it's alkalized. But if it doesn't, if it just says cocoa beans, or you check out the manufacturer website and maybe they say something about alkalization that it's not, then it is going to have a high amount of polyphenols, of flavonols that are good for you. But you have to remember too that it's also not going to have that strong cocoa flavor. It's going to have a very different flavor as well. So it sounds like I haven't been speaking too highly of cocoa powder, because in my opinion, it's not at the same level of a good quality cocoa bean or a good quality chocolate. But there are uses for it. So what are some of those uses? It's a really good thickening agent. So if you're making a chocolate flavored based product that's like a pastry cream or a custard or a pudding, cocoa powder in conjunction with chocolate or just cocoa powder is going to help thicken that up, because cocoa powder is mostly starches and they're going to absorb the water and make a thicker product. So anything that you want a little bit thicker, cocoa powder can do that. Just remember though that if you are, let's say you're using, a good quality bean to bar chocolate, maybe you made the chocolate yourself, it has these really nice flavors in there. You're not going to get those flavors in the cocoa powder. Usually even a better cocoa powder is just going to have a very basic cocoa flavor, and there's nothing more to that. You might not want anything more than that, but that's what you're going to get from it. You can also use cocoa powder in products where you want the cocoa flavor, but you don't want the cocoa butter. Sometimes it can make things difficult or more complicated, right? The cocoa bean or chocolate has a lot of fat in it. And so if you're making a sponge cake or a meringue, you don't want to add a lot of fat in there. So the cocoa powder is a nice way to incorporate the chocolate flavor and without ruining your product. And it's also a cheaper alternative if that's something that you are looking for. So this brings us to the final question: what is the best cocoa powder? And it kind of depends. It depends on your purpose, right? So if you want cocoa powder because of the antioxidant and that nutritional value, then you're probably not going to go with alkalized cocoa powder. You're probably going to have to go with a raw cocoa powder, because most cocoa powder on the market, pretty much all of it is alkalized or Dutched, or like I said, you'll see on the ingredient list, does it say sodium bicarbonate? Does it say Dutch? Does it say alkalized? And then it also depends on other concerns of the product other than the cocoa powder itself. So a lot of people now will look for things like fair trade, organic, and other certifications. And those are good things in and of themselves. Just remember that it's not synonymous with quality. So you can still have a bulk cacao, poor quality cocoa powder that's certified organic, that's certified fair trade. And there's degrees of it, right? It's not one or the other. But that might be a concern for you, so that's something that will reflect on the price. If you have a fair trade cacao powder, hopefully those farmers are getting paid a more reasonable wage, but that's also what's increasing the cost. It's not necessarily because it's a really good cocoa powder. It could be an average cocoa powder, but you're paying more because you like the fact that the growers of the cocoa powder are hopefully getting paid more. And the final point is personal preference, right? So like I was saying, there's a bulk of degrees of cocoa powder out there. Most of it's all made from the bulk cacao. But the way the process is, the way they roast it, how much of the testa is going to be in there, how much it's alkalized. It's all going to change the product. If it's alkalized a little bit more, a little bit less, it's going to change the pH, and that might affect the recipe that you're including that in. It'll have different levels of fat. Even though cocoa powder removes a bunch of the fat, every manufacturer, it might be slightly different as well. So keep those things in mind. And then it also comes down to taste. So it comes down to, try different cocoa powders in your area and see which one you like the flavor of more. Maybe they all taste the same. Or see which one interacts best with your recipe. Maybe some of them absorb more of the moisture than others, and you might have to adjust or go from there. But keep all those things in mind. Now, a lot of people may be upset that I'm not pointing out at a single brand or a specific type, and that's not what I do. If you've been to my classes, if you read my website, my job is to really give you the information, and then you have to make a decision based on that. Hopefully you guys have learned a lot. If you have any more questions about cocoa powder, feel free to send me a message. You can visit beantobarworld.com/question drop. And a lot of people have been throwing me questions, and I use these questions from time to time. And I'm going to start using them more in my videos as well. So if you have a specific question or a topic, go to beantobarworld.com/question drop and just shoot me a message. And I hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you.